I want everybody in America to understand what they just heard from the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee in the United States House of Representatives. Your 2-year-old should be forced to be masked. That is what the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee just said here on the floor of the House of Representatives. I thank the Speaker. Been intrigued to listening to my colleagues with their newfound respect for private business and not wanting to have regulatory interference with private business. Well, here we are talking about the REINS Act, and what we're trying to do is ensure that you can't have unelected bureaucrats making decisions that have massive economic impacts and have major impacts on the lives of the American people. With all due respect to the ranking member from Judiciary, what we're talking about is not saying you're ending what the folks in the administrative state are saying about regulations. What we're saying is that they got to come to Congress if it's going to have a major impact. They got to come demonstrate what it is they're proposing. If they've got some issue involving radiation, if they've got some issue that involves some complexities, come make the case if you're going to have a massive economic impact like $100 million. And here I'm offering an amendment that goes a little bit beyond that. Not just the economic impact, but the impact on our society, the impact on businesses to be able to function, the impact on people to be able to go out and carry out their lives. My amendment that I'm offering here, the number 14, it expands the definition of a major rule in the REINS Act to include any rule that references one of President Biden's major so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion executive orders. This means that Congress would vote up or down on any rule promulgated by the executive branch that pushes radical gender or racial ideologies, regardless of whether it's estimated to carry a fiscal or economic impact. Why? Because the American people are tired of this stuff. They're tired of seeing this radical agenda being promoted by the federal government and pressed upon the private citizens of this country. The executive orders in this amendment covers are meant to sow division among the American people in pursuit of radical racial and gender ideologies. For example, EO 13985, which is designed to ensure that racial equity and support for underserved communities throughout the federal government. Well, that sounds nice in a title, but the fact is it's directed every federal agency to conduct equity assessments to determine whether new policies, regulations, or guidance documents may be necessary to advance equity in agency actions and programs. It's effectively made diversity, equity, and inclusion one of the most important factors, including at the Department of Defense. We're not focusing on making sure our Department of Defense can defeat China. We're focusing on making it a social engineering experiment wrapped in a uniform. I wonder why we're having trouble recruiting people. It's been referenced in CMS rules on health equity that flirt with forcing providers to prioritize health care based on race. There are news articles about this. It has been referenced in EPA and Department of Interior rules that advance so-called environmental justice. Executive Order 13988, preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity on sexual orientation. Again, the title sounds, oh, that must be all nice and good. Well, it led to an HHS proposed rule that could compel hospitals receiving federal funds to perform gender-affirming care, including surgeries. It has been used to justify moves by the VA to provide gender-affirming care to veterans on taxpayer dollars. Or Executive Order 14021, quote, guaranteeing an educational environment free from discrimination on the basis of sex, including sexual orientation or gender identity. Except the problem is it's discriminating against women, which Riley Gaines all too often knows because she was forced to swim against a dude. And we all know she was forced to swim against a dude. It was referenced in the Department of Education's proposed rule to leverage Title IX to restrict schools' ability to prohibit biological males from competing in girls' sports. Ironically, the rule recognizes schools may need flexibility to issue such a restriction for, quote, fairness in competition or preventing sports-related injury. The fact is, the American people are sick and tired of politicizing our entire culture through the executive actions that are being executed by this president without check from Congress, which we don't believe would have a chance of getting through the people's house. And with that, I reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserve. With right reason, the gentleman from New York seeks recognition.
Madam Chair, I claim the time in opposition.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Chair, the REINS Act would already frustrate the point of government by grinding the critical actions of our agencies to a halt. Why Mr. Roy, and I presume the majority generally, feels the need to also include efforts to protect some of the most vulnerable among us is beyond me. America has a long history of discrimination, and efforts to include these historically marginalized groups should be celebrated and supported, not subjected to further scrutiny by Congress just because the majority disagrees with supporting these individuals. May I remind you that we represent all the people, and amendments like this undermine our service to our constituents. And I would ask, why should we tell hospitals not to perform certain medical procedures? If gender-affirming surgery is necessary for the patient, and the doctor says it is, why shouldn't the VA hospital provide such surgery? We do not, I presume, want to say it's because we want to discriminate against transgender people, or we want to discriminate against gay or lesbian people. I hope it's not what we're saying. But that's what this amendment seems to do. So I oppose this amendment because it goes against our notions of equality and our notions of fairness. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York, reserve. Mr. Roy from Texas, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank the Speaker. If my Democratic colleagues support these executive orders so much, if they believe that these are the best things since sliced bread, that we need to have all of these orders that are turning our entire society upside down, that are redefining traditional roles in society that we understand and the difference between man and woman, if they're so excited about those policies, then why are they worried about voting on them? What's the problem? Why must they just be executed by a faceless bureaucrat at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue or in the alphabet soup of the agencies in this town? Why shouldn't this body, the People's House and the Senate, speak? That's all we're talking about in the REINS Act and these amendments. I reserve.
The gentleman from Texas,
Prepared
reserve.
to close.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Prepared to close. Yield back.
Gentleman from Texas.
I yield.
The gentleman from Texas yield back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Chair, rather. The gentleman says, why don't we legislate on some of this? We have. But I remind the gentleman that last year we passed the Respect for Marriage Act, codifying the rights of two men to marry each other or two women to marry each other because we respect freedom. The amendment does not respect freedom. The amendment, by its description, by its sponsor, would say, no, we don't want to do gender-affirming surgery. We don't want to perform surgery that people need because we disapprove of them. That is wrong. The REINS Act is a very bad act for all the reasons I've stated many times already today. I'm not going to repeat them. This amendment would make it worse because diversity, equity, and inclusion, executive orders, are things to be celebrated, not things to decry. I yield back.
Yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those who oppose say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Chair,
the amendment is
Madam Chair,
agreed to. Gentleman from New York.
On that, I request a roll call vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 15, printed in Part A of House Report 118-108. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 15, printed in Part A of House Report number 118-108, offered by Mr. Roy of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 495, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy.
I thank the Speaker. With respect to what the gentleman was just talking about with the marriage vote last year, regardless of one's belief and vote on the outcome of that policy, the point is Congress voted. And the fact is here, we have rules being promulgated by bureaucrats that the People's House never gets a chance to speak to other than through a Congressional Review Act, which you're only allowed to do in a minimal amount of time. REINS Act actually gives power to the People's House and Article 1 under the Constitution. And I want to do that here on another issue. We would like to expand the definition of major rule to include any rule likely to result in an increase in mandatory vaccinations. This means Congress would vote to approve any rule that promulgated by the executive branch to push mandatory vaccines. Last Congress, remember, we were told we would vote to, we were told to wait for the courts to save the American people from an unconstitutional vaccine. While we fiddled and waited for the courts to catch up, millions of Americans were forced to choose between their job and a jab, and that likely did not need and that didn't stop transmission. On September 29, 2021, President Biden announced vaccine mandates for upwards of 100 million Americans, forcing Americans to choose between their jobs and a jab. On March 11, 2023, Biden finally ended his unconstitutional vaccine mandates at the end of the COVID emergency, frankly, because we were forcing it and forcing the question. The OSHA mandate, which was struck down by the Supreme Court and formally withdrawn on January 28, 2022, a year prior, required all businesses with 100-plus employees to either vaccine or test. Why should we wait on the Supreme Court to check the unconstitutional, unlawful, and tyrannical actions by an executive branch that shut down the greatest economy in the history of the world, forcing people to choose between their livelihoods, their ability to make money, their families, their ability to go to school, the ability of a nurse to be able to go in and perform her job in a hospital? We did that. Let's not forget that we did that. We watched Secretary Becerra fumbling yesterday, fumbling in a hearing, unable to answer the question. Can you tell me, sir, whether or not it was any benefit whatsoever for 2-year-old kids to be forced to wear masks? And we had mandates through the Head Start program, and he refused to answer the question in committee because he knew full well he has no good answer to that question. He knows it, and everybody in America knows it. So this is about wresting power away from a bureaucratic state that shut down this economy, harmed the American people, and it should never happen again. That is the point of the REINS Act. It is to wrestle power back from Article 2 in the executive branch, no matter who is there. Look, the Trump administration's hands, unclean. The Biden administration's hands, unclean. This is a nonpartisan statement. The people's house should speak. We should stand up to the tyranny of an executive branch that overstepped its bounds and restricted the freedom and liberties of the American people and harmed them. I reserve.
From Texas reserve. For what reason? The gentleman from New York seeks recognition.
Madam Chair, I rise to claim the time in opposition.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Chair, yet again we have another amendment aimed at dividing us instead of allowing us to serve the people who elected us. Vaccinations help us eradicate terrible diseases like smallpox, polio, measles, mumps, tuberculosis, rubella, and on and on and on. Adding this amendment would not help us govern. It will not help us serve our constituents. Instead, it will just serve to undermine necessary health and safety rules. We here in this chamber cannot know what contagious diseases we may face in the future, and I oppose any amendment that would undermine our ability to protect our constituents. Madam Chair, before I was allowed to go to school, I won't tell you how many years ago that was, I had to be vaccinated for diphtheria, for whooping cough, for the diseases that they then knew had to vaccinate against. Nothing has changed. We have to vaccinate people to prevent diseases and pandemics. The gentleman asked, why should a 2-year-old, well, and the fact of the matter is that people should require to be either vaccinated, especially a nurse who is dealing with patients, who is breathing on those patients. She can transmit the disease. So certainly she should be required to be vaccinated, because the vaccination not only protects her, it protects against transmission of the disease to the next person. And the healthcare worker certainly ought to be required to be vaccinated. And when we have a pandemic like COVID-19 pandemic that we had, 2-year-olds should have been required to wear masks. It would be child abuse for parents not to do that because there was no vaccination available for 2-year-olds. And the only way to protect them against COVID was to have them wear masks. And these mandates are meant to protect the public's health and safety. God willing, we won't have another pandemic such as we had. But in the future, We will be required, I presume, to be vaccinated against major threatening diseases. And that is right. And to expand the major rule to include any increase in mandatory vaccinations is intended to prevent mandatory vaccinations. That is a crime against the public health. I reserve.
Gentleman from New York, reserve. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy.
Well, I'm tempted to yield all my time to the gentleman from New York because he's basically making the case for me more effectively than I can. The gentleman from New York is basically acknowledging everything that I'm sitting here saying that I'm trying to do to protect the American people from the tyrannical state of the executive branch. But in this case, my Democratic colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I want everybody in America to understand what they just heard from the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee in the United States House of Representatives. Your 2-year-old should be forced to be masked. That is what the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee just said here on the floor of the House of Representatives, that the power of the government, the full power of the federal government, should be a part of ensuring and forcing your children, your 2-year-old child, to be masked. We heard it yesterday when the Secretary of HHS refused to actually answer that question. So I'm really glad to hear that the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee acknowledges what everybody in America understands, which is that the Democratic Party, led by the president and by my Democratic colleagues in the House and the Senate, are fully comfortable with the power of the government being used to shut down your businesses, force you out of work, unless you take an experimental vaccine that has not been proven to actually do what the gentleman just said, which is with respect to transmissions. More importantly, my father, who's 80 years old, is dealing with the ravages of polio. I firmly understand the importance of vaccines, and I'm proud that my children and I have been able to be protected by those vaccines, fully tested after years of testing. But to say that this politicized vaccine should have been used to shut down the economy and to kill the ability of my constituents to be able to go out about their lives and to force children into the corner wearing masks to get set back years in their education, that is precisely why this amendment matters. It is precisely why we're here reining in the federal government, and it is precisely why this amendment would make this a better piece of legislation, and why I hope my colleagues will support it. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, yield back. Gentleman from New York, Mr.
Mr. Speaker, why the COVID-19 vaccine should be more politicized than any other vaccine, I don't know. I don't understand that. And it is precisely because, and why it is the COVID-19 vaccine was considered by the gentleman politicized, I don't understand that either. It's just another vaccine. It's another vaccine for a very raging pandemic we just had, and which is hopefully over, although people are still dying of COVID-19. And people should get vaccinated against it if they haven't been vaccinated. But the REINS Act would make it much more difficult to require or even to drop the requirement for vaccination. And this amendment would specifically make it more difficult. And that's ridiculous from a public health point of view. And therefore, I oppose the amendment, and I yield back.